September 14, 1940. RAF Bawdsey, Suffolk Coast, England. The cathode ray tube glowed green in the darkness, casting shadows across Flight Sergeant William Marsh's weathered face. Outside, the North Sea whispered against cliffs that had witnessed Viking invasions, Spanish armadas, and now, the electronic pulse of a new kind of sentinel. Marsh adjusted his headset, fingers dancing across dials that most operators touched with reverence and uncertainty. But Marsh possessed something his superiors had not yet named: intuition married to mathematics. The chain-home radar stations stretched along Britain's eastern coast, like electronic lighthouses, their steel towers piercing the fog of war with invisible beams. Official doctrine prescribed standard calibration procedures: adjust amplitude, verify range gates, trust the manual. Marsh had discovered something else entirely by deliberately misaligning the transmitter phase by precisely 3.7 degrees and cross-referencing the resulting echo distortions with barometric pressure readings. He could detect not just aircraft, but their formation density, altitude variations, and, most remarkably, the electromagnetic signature of engines running at idle on distant airfields. Tonight, his unauthorized modification would reveal what German planners believed impossible to hide: an invasion fleet of 847 aircraft, concealed in the electronic shadow of the Dutch coast, preparing for Operation Seelove's final gambit. The Battle of Britain had entered its third month, and exhaustion permeated every corner of fighter command. Air Chief Marshal Dowding's carefully rationed Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons had held against Goering's daytime armadas, but intelligence estimates varied wildly. Some analysts predicted the Luftwaffe had suffered crippling losses. Others whispered that German aircraft production had somehow accelerated beyond British comprehension. The radar stations represented Britain's technological edge, a mathematical miracle that transformed invisible radio waves into tactical intelligence. Yet the system possessed fundamental limitations. The chain-home network could detect aircraft approaching across the channel, providing perhaps 15 minutes warning. It could estimate altitude through crude triangulation. It could count, approximately. But it could not see aircraft sitting silently on airfields in occupied Europe. It could not penetrate the electronic noise of ground clutter, weather systems, or the deliberate jamming signals that German technicians had begun deploying. Marsh understood these limitations intimately. A former Cambridge scholarship student who'd abandoned mathematics for the RAF after his younger brother died at Dunkirk, he approached radar operation with academic rigor that baffled his fellow sergeants. While others adjusted their equipment to match standardized settings, Marsh filled notebooks with observations: how seagull flocks created distinct echo patterns, how temperature inversions bent radio waves in predictable arcs, how the metallic composition of German bombers produced subtly different reflections than British fighters. His commanding officer, squadron leader Edmund Hartley, tolerated Marsh's eccentricities because the results spoke clearly. Marsh's station consistently provided the most accurate intercept vectors, his range estimates proved reliable within 200 yards, and his altitude calls allowed controllers to vector fighters with minimal fuel waste. But Hartley had explicitly forbidden experimental modifications after Marsh's previous improvisation, adjusting receiver gain during transmission cycles, had temporarily blinded 3 adjacent stations during a crucial intercept. What Hartley didn't know was that Marsh had continued his experiments, working through the graveyard shift when supervision thinned and desperation made innovation acceptable. The phase shift calibration trick had emerged from pure accident, a loose connection in the transmitter assembly that Marsh had initially attempted to repair. Before tightening the connection, he'd noticed something extraordinary in the resulting echo patterns: a faint rhythmic distortion that shouldn't exist, ghost signals, reflections from sources that weren't moving, weren't approaching, but were definitely there. Across the channel, 847 Luftwaffe aircraft sat in carefully dispersed formations, engines warm, pilots briefed, awaiting dawn and Goering's final order. Marsh first documented the anomaly on September 9th. During routine calibration at 0347 hours, with the transmitter assembly partially disconnected, his scope revealed patterns that defied standard interpretation. Instead of the clean sweeps indicating empty sky or the sharp spikes marking approaching aircraft, he observed subtle, persistent fluctuations, like static, but rhythmic, periodic, almost biological. He cross-referenced weather data: high pressure system, minimal precipitation, temperature 14 degrees Celsius. He checked equipment logs, all systems nominal except his deliberate phase misalignment. He consulted his notebooks, finding similar patterns from 3 nights prior, when German bombing raids had inexplicably paused. The fluctuations had appeared at bearing 127 degrees, range approximately 180 miles, far beyond normal detection parameters, deep inside occupied Netherlands. The mathematics troubled him. Standard radar theory suggested his signals shouldn't propagate that far, and certainly couldn't resolve stationary targets at such distance. Yet the patterns persisted night after night, growing stronger. Marsh began recording the fluctuations with obsessive precision, timing their periodicity. Every 73 seconds, a subtle spike. Every 73 seconds, like clockwork. It took him 3 days to formulate a hypothesis that seemed simultaneously brilliant and insane. The signals weren't reflecting from aircraft in flight. They were reflecting from aircraft engines, running engines specifically, generating electromagnetic interference at frequencies that his misaligned transmitter could somehow detect. The 73-second periodicity matched perfectly with standard Luftwaffe engine warm-up cycles. Throttle to operational temperature, idle for 60 seconds, throttle again. Mechanics preparing aircraft for immediate deployment followed this cycle religiously. Marsh drafted a report for Hartley, then burned it. The theory seemed too fantastical, too conveniently aligned with what Fighter Command desperately wanted to hear. He needed verification. On September 12th, he convinced the night duty officer, a sympathetic lieutenant who owed Marsh 3 pounds from poker, to authorize a routine maintenance calibration that required shutting down adjacent stations for 20 minutes. Alone with his equipment, Marsh refined the phase displacement, adjusted receiver sensitivity to unprecedented levels, and waited. The scope bloomed with signals, not scattered noise, but organized clusters. 7 distinct concentration points, each corresponding to known Luftwaffe airfields in Holland and Belgium. Marsh counted the fluctuations, calculated aircraft density based on signal strength, and arrived at a number that stopped his breath. Over 800 aircraft, in position, engines cycling, invisible to conventional detection. Across the channel, German meteorologists studied weather maps, calculating optimal invasion conditions for September 15th. Hartley's office at 06:23 hours smelled of stale cigarettes and unread reports. The squadron leader looked up from his desk as Marsh entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that would have earned reprimand under normal circumstances. But Marsh's expression communicated urgency beyond military courtesy. "Sir, I need you to look at something. Now." Hartley studied the younger man's face, chalk pale from sleepless nights, eyes bloodshot but burning with absolute certainty. "Marsh, if you've blown another transmitter experimenting..." "I've found them, sir. The invasion fleet. All of it." The words hung in the air between them. Hartley's hand froze halfway to his cigarette case. For 3 weeks, intelligence had debated German intentions. Photo reconnaissance showed airfield activity, but nothing conclusive. The Kriegsmarine's invasion barges remained scattered in channel ports, seemingly abandoned. Some analysts argued Hitler had postponed Seelova indefinitely. Others insisted the attack was imminent, but location uncertain. Marsh spread his documentation across Hartley's desk. Oscilloscope photographs, hand-plotted graphs, calculations dense with trigonometric proofs. "The phase shift calibration I developed, it's detecting engine electromagnetic signatures at extended range. Here, here, and here." His finger stabbed at coordinates. Schiphol, Eindhoven, Gilserijen, Dielen, Bergen op Zoom, Woensdrecht, and Antwerp-Doorn. 7 airfields, all running continuous warm-up cycles. "I'm calculating approximately 120 aircraft per location, based on signal density and periodicity analysis." Hartley examined the papers with growing tension. The mathematics appeared sound. He'd studied enough Cambridge scholarship applications to recognize genuine insight, but the implications seemed catastrophic. "You're telling me there are 840 German aircraft sitting on airfields in Holland, invisible to conventional reconnaissance, preparing for immediate deployment?" 847, sir. "My count's been consistent for 3 nights running. The periodicity is too regular to be random atmospheric interference. The geographical distribution matches known Luftwaffe staging doctrine perfectly. And sir," Marsh's voice dropped to barely audible, "the cycles intensified tonight. They're not just maintaining readiness, they're conducting final pre-flight checks." Hartley reached for his telephone, then paused. "Chain of command required verification, peer review, confirmation through official channels. But official channels moved slowly, and if Marsh was correct, there were no hours to spare. Fighter Command's squadron assignments assumed scattered German forces, not a concentrated armada. Every airfield in southern England would need immediate alert status. How confident are you in this data, Flight Sergeant? Marsh met his commander's eyes without hesitation. I'd stake my commission on it, sir. And possibly the invasion. By our 800 hours, Bawdsey Station had transformed into controlled chaos. Hartley had bypassed normal protocol, placing calls directly to RAF Bentley Priory, Fighter Command headquarters, where skeptical staff officers demanded evidence that seemed impossible to provide. How could one rogue radar operator detect aircraft that photo reconnaissance couldn't confirm, using methods that violated every established calibration standard? Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, listened to Hartley's report with the exhausted patience of a man who'd fielded 1,000 intelligence fragments, 90% worthless. Squadron leader, you're asking me to scramble every available squadron based on electromagnetic anomalies detected through unauthorized equipment modifications? Sir, Flight Sergeant Marsh's track record speaks for itself. His intercept vectors have been consistently superior. His intercept vectors observe aircraft actually in flight, Squadron leader. You're claiming he can now see through solid Earth and detect engines at rest 180 miles away. Do you understand how that sounds? Hartley did. It sounded insane. Yet Marsh stood beside him, unflinching, presenting additional calculations to increasingly bewildered intelligence officers. The young sergeant explained wave propagation theory, atmospheric ducting effects, electromagnetic signature analysis, concepts that existed primarily in academic journals, not operational doctrine. Meanwhile, at Schiphol Airfield outside Amsterdam, Hauptmann Kurt Adler conducted final briefing with his Kampfgeschwader 54 bomber crews. The meteorological window had finally aligned. High pressure, minimal cloud cover, moderate winds. Göring's order remained conditional, awaiting Hitler's final authorization, but operational readiness had reached maximum. Every aircraft had been fueled, armed, and positioned. Pilots had memorized routes to assigned targets across southern England, radar stations, fighter airfields, command centers. The plan called for overwhelming the British detection network through sheer numerical superiority. Launch every available aircraft simultaneously, saturate Fighter Command's response capacity, achieve air superiority through mathematical inevitability. What Adler didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to detect, was that their greatest operational advantage was evaporating in a cramped radar station on the Suffolk coast, where a Cambridge dropout with forbidden knowledge was systematically dismantling the Third Reich's carefully constructed surprise. Back at Bentley Priory, Park made his decision with the grim calculation that defined his command style. Keep monitoring. If those signatures remain consistent through 1,200 hours, I'll authorize preliminary squadron alerts. But Hartley, if your sergeant is wrong, his career ends today, and possibly yours. Across the North Sea, 847 aircraft waited, and time compressed toward a single irreversible moment. The verification process revealed institutional tension that had simmered throughout Britain's technological revolution. Older officers trained in visual reconnaissance and human intelligence distrusted the cathode ray mysticism of radar operations. Younger technical specialists, many recruited from universities, possessed theoretical knowledge but limited operational judgment. Marsh existed in the uncomfortable intersection, too unconventional for traditional command, too practical for pure research. At 10:15 hours, Professor Reginald Jones arrived at Bawdsey, a civilian scientist serving as scientific advisor to intelligence services. Jones had pioneered Britain's understanding of German radio navigation systems, developing countermeasures that had systematically degraded Luftwaffe bombing accuracy. If anyone could validate or demolish Marsh's methodology, it was Jones. The professor examined Marsh's equipment with clinical precision, running diagnostic tests while asking questions that cut to mathematical fundamentals. You're suggesting that engine ignition systems generate sufficient electromagnetic radiation to produce detectable reflections at 180 miles. Not ignition systems alone, sir. The combination of metallic airframe mass, synchronized engines cycling across multiple aircraft, and atmospheric ducting conditions. The phase shift calibration enhances signal-to-noise ratio by approximately 340%, allowing detection of signatures normally lost in background interference. Jones studied the oscilloscope traces, comparing them to atmospheric data. His expression remained professionally neutral, But Marsh detected subtle shifts, a slight nod here, a softening around the eyes there. Finally, Jones straightened. This shouldn't work according to established theory, which means either your theory is wrong or established theory is incomplete. He turned to Hartley. I need 3 hours with your equipment and access to previous night's recordings. If Flight Sergeant Marsh's observations prove consistent and repeatable, we may have stumbled upon something rather more significant than immediate tactical intelligence. What Jones recognized but didn't yet articulate was that Marsh had accidentally discovered principles that would later be formalized as passive radar detection. By 1943, British engineers would develop dedicated systems exploiting these concepts. But in September 1940, it existed only as one sergeant's intuitive hack, born from desperation and mathematical curiosity. At Schiphol, German ground crews completed final weapons loading. Bomber formations would carry a mixture of high explosive and incendiary ordnance, targeting British radar stations first, then fighter airfields, then command infrastructure. Total mission duration, 6 hours. Expected British resistance, manageable, based on intelligence suggesting fighter command's remaining strength numbered perhaps 200 operational aircraft, scattered and exhausted. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong, but German planners didn't know that yet. Neither did they know that their final operational secret, the massed fleet's location, was being systematically exposed by technology they hadn't imagined possible. Jones's verification process unfolded with methodical intensity. He replicated Marsh's phase shift calibration, documented the resulting signal patterns, and cross-referenced them with known German airfield locations. By 1300 hours, his conclusion was inescapable. The signatures were real, consistent, and almost certainly represented massed aircraft conducting pre-flight preparations. The strategic implications cascaded through Fighter Command's planning cells. Park immediately authorized full squadron alerts across 11 Group. Controllers began repositioning aircraft to intercept positions based on Marsh's predicted approach vectors. Ground crews raced to maximize operational readiness, conducting hasty repairs on damaged Spitfires and Hurricanes that had been scheduled for longer maintenance cycles. But a darker calculation emerged in Dowding's headquarters. If Germany launched its entire available bomber force simultaneously, Fighter Command faced mathematical impossibility. Even with Marsh's advance warning, British squadrons would be outnumbered nearly 4-1. Standard intercept doctrine called for attacking bomber formations before they reached targets, but achieving favorable engagement geometry against 800-plus aircraft would require perfect coordination across every available squadron. Dowding studied the plotting table with cold assessment. We fought them piecemeal for 3 months. They finally learned. This is their best move. Overwhelming force, single thrust, accept whatever losses necessary to achieve local superiority. His senior operations officer ventured carefully. Sir, if we concentrate all available squadrons for maximum intercept strength, we leave the Midlands completely undefended. If this is a feint, it's not a feint. Flight Sergeant Marsh has given us something unprecedented. Knowledge of German intentions before execution. We either trust it completely or ignore it entirely. There's no middle ground. The decision carried existential weight. Concentrate everything south, intercept the massed formation, and gamble that German intelligence hadn't orchestrated an elaborate deception. Dowding had built his defensive strategy on preserving fighter strength, avoiding decisive engagement, trading space for time. Now circumstance demanded the opposite. Commit everything, risk everything, in single overwhelming counterattack. At 14:25 hours, the operations order went out. Every operational squadron in Fighter Command would be airborne by 1500 hours, positioned in layered defensive arcs across the predicted German approach corridor. It represented the largest single-day fighter deployment in RAF history, a concentration of force that would either shatter the Luftwaffe's invasion capability or leave Britain defenseless if Marsh's calculations proved wrong. In Suffolk, Marsh monitored his equipment with hands that had begun trembling from exhaustion and pressure. The signatures remained constant, the engine cycles continuing their methodical rhythm. Across the Channel, German pilots received final orders, and 847 aircraft prepared to write history in blood and mathematics. September 15, 1940, 600 hours. The dawn broke clear and cold across the North Sea. German meteorologists had calculated correctly. Perfect visibility, minimal winds, cloud ceiling above 15,000 feet. At Schiphol and 6 other airfields, The first formations began rolling toward takeoff position. Hauptmann Adler led his bomber staffel into the brightening sky, watching his squadron form up with practiced precision. Behind him, wave after wave of aircraft climbed, circled, assembled into the massive aerial armada that would decide Britain's fate. German operational planning called for simultaneous approach from multiple vectors, overwhelming British radar stations through sheer target saturation. Intelligence estimates suggested Fighter Command could scramble perhaps 150 aircraft in response. Manageable odds for 847 attackers. The formation would cross the channel at 18,000 feet, maintaining tight defensive box formations that maximized mutual protective fire. British fighters would face impossible mathematics. Too many targets, too few interceptors, insufficient ammunition and fuel to sustain prolonged engagement. What German planners didn't know was that their fundamental premise had collapsed 18 hours earlier, when a single radar operator had accidentally discovered their entire deployment. At RAF Hornchurch, squadron leader Brian Kingcombe led his Spitfire squadron into climbing turns, positioning at 25,000 feet above the predicted intercept point. Around him, the sky filled with British fighters, 11 groups full strength, plus reinforcements from 10 and 12 groups, nearly 300 aircraft vectored into coordinated attack positions. Ground controllers fed continuous updates based on Marsh's real-time tracking, positioning squadrons with unprecedented precision. At 06:27 hours, British radar operators detected the German formation's takeoff signatures through conventional means. The massive electromagnetic bloom confirmed what Marsh had predicted. Every available Luftwaffe bomber, climbing in coordinated waves. Controllers watched the plotting tables with grim satisfaction. The enemy had committed exactly as Marsh's intelligence suggested, and Fighter Command had achieved perfect defensive positioning. Adler saw them at 06:43 hours. British fighters, everywhere at every altitude, positioned not reactively, but preemptively. Instead of scrambling to intercept, they were waiting in ambush. The mathematical advantage he'd counted on had evaporated. His radio filled with urgent voices as other formation leaders reported the same impossible situation. The British had known, somehow they'd known, and prepared accordingly. In Suffolk, Marsh monitored the developing engagement through radar signatures that blossomed across his scope like deadly flowers. His unauthorized calibration trick had done what seemed impossible, transformed invisible preparation into tactical intelligence. But success carried its own terrible weight. He'd helped initiate the largest single air battle in history, and hundreds of men on both sides would die because of knowledge he'd provided. The engagement unfolded with calculated ferocity. British fighters struck from altitude advantage, diving through German formations with disciplined precision. Kingcombe's squadron ripped through the first bomber wave, cannon fire devastating the tightly packed Heinkels and Dorniers. But the Luftwaffe responded with professional competence honed through 2 years of combat experience. Messerschmitt escorts engaged British fighters, while bomber formations tightened defensive boxes, creating interlocking fields of fire. What made September 15th different wasn't individual courage or tactical excellence. Both sides possessed those in abundance. What made it decisive was information asymmetry. British controllers knew German formation strength, approach vectors, and timing with unprecedented precision. They vectored squadrons into optimal attack positions, rotated fresh fighters into engagement while pulling damaged aircraft back for rearming, and maintained coordinated pressure that prevented German formations from achieving their objectives. Adler fought his bomber through 3 separate fighter attacks, watching his formation dissolve around him. To his left, his wingman exploded in orange flame. To his right, another Heinkel spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His crew fought with desperate professionalism, but the mathematics had turned catastrophically against them. British fighters seemed inexhaustible. Each wave that broke off was replaced by fresh squadrons, perfectly positioned, perfectly informed. By 07:30 hours, German formation commanders faced reality. The mission had failed. They couldn't reach assigned targets through this concentration of defensive force. Bombing raids required formation integrity to survive British fighters. Scattered individual aircraft would be destroyed piecemeal. The order to withdraw came at 07:44, and surviving German aircraft turned back toward occupied Europe. The cost was horrifying. British intelligence would later calculate 185 German aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair, more than 1/5 of the attacking force, eliminated in barely 90 minutes of combat. Fighter Command lost 31 aircraft, but recovered most pilots. More critically, Britain had demonstrated capacity to counter massed attack through superior intelligence and coordinated response. In Berlin, Goering received initial reports with disbelief that gradually calcified into rage. The aerial supremacy required for Operation Seelöwe had not been achieved. It would not be achieved. Hitler's invasion plans, already delayed multiple times, would be postponed indefinitely, then abandoned entirely. The Third Reich would turn east toward Russia, and Britain would survive. At Bautzen, Marsh sat before his equipment, watching the signatures retreat. His hands still trembled. Professor Jones stood beside him silent, understanding that some knowledge carries unbearable weight. The young sergeant had changed history through unauthorized curiosity, and both men knew the moral equation balanced in ways that permitted neither celebration nor regret, only exhausted acknowledgement of necessity's brutal mathematics. The aftermath unfolded across multiple dimensions: tactical, strategic, and deeply personal. Fighter Command conducted systematic debriefings, examining combat reports to understand how British defenses had achieved such devastating effectiveness. Pilots described arriving at intercept positions to find German formations already approaching, described coordination between squadrons that seemed choreographed rather than improvised, described an organizational efficiency that exceeded previous operational standards. The truth remained classified at highest levels. Only Dowding, Park, Jones, Hartley, and a handful of senior intelligence officers knew about Marsh's phase shift calibration technique. Official reports attributed the victory to improved radar coordination and fortunate timing. No mention appeared of unauthorized equipment modifications or theoretical breakthroughs that shouldn't have been possible according to established science. Marsh received a private commendation and immediate promotion to warrant officer. Publicly, he remained an anonymous radar operator. Privately, Jones had begun documenting his methodology for potential weaponization. The principles Marsh had stumbled upon would eventually inform post-war radar development, but in September 1940, they represented dangerous knowledge that couldn't be widely shared without revealing Britain's intelligence advantage. The strategic consequences rippled outward with historical momentum. Hitler, confronted with clear evidence that aerial supremacy over Britain was unachievable, formally postponed Operation Seelöwe on September 17th. Planning staffs began shifting focus toward Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Russia scheduled for June 1941. The Luftwaffe would continue bombing British cities through the Winter Blitz, but strategic initiative had passed permanently from German hands. Adler survived the engagement, nursing his damaged bomber back to Schiphol with 2 engines destroyed and his entire crew wounded. He filed reports describing impossible British coordination, suggesting their intelligence capabilities exceeded German assumptions. His warnings were noted, filed, and ultimately ignored by commanders who preferred comfortable certainty over uncomfortable truth. At Cambridge, where Marsh had once studied mathematics before war interrupted academic ambitions, his former professors would never know that their scholarship student had applied pure theory to create tactical advantage that altered civilization's trajectory. The mathematics of wave propagation, electromagnetic theory and signal processing, abstract concepts explored in peaceful seminar rooms, had manifested as life-and-death knowledge in the hands of an exhausted sergeant who'd simply refused to accept that established doctrine represented the limits of possible. Jones watched Marsh work in the days following September 15th, recognizing something beyond technical skill, intellectual courage to question authority when evidence suggested new understanding. "You changed the war," he told Marsh quietly one evening. "They'll never know, but you changed it." Marsh adjusted his equipment without looking up. "I just calibrated the equipment properly, sir. That's all." Through October and November, as German bombers shifted to nighttime attacks against British cities, Marsh continued refining his technique. The phase shift calibration became standard practice at Bautzen, though officially designated Alternative Detection Protocol Marsh 1 to obscure its unconventional origins. Other radar stations began implementing similar modifications under Jones's supervision, creating a network-wide enhancement that dramatically improved long-range detection capabilities. But the personal cost manifested in ways that numbers couldn't capture. Marsh developed chronic insomnia, haunted by calculations of how many German airmen had died because of intelligence he'd provided. Hartley noticed the deterioration, the trembling hands, the gaunt complexion, the 1,000-yard stare that infantry veterans knew too well. Modern psychology would eventually name this condition post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1940, they called it flying stress, or simply didn't name it at all. "You saved Britain," Hartley told him during a mandatory medical evaluation. "Perhaps thousands of civilian lives. The invasion would have been catastrophic. I helped kill 185 men, sir. I can calculate their faces from the numbers. German mothers are receiving telegrams because I couldn't accept standard calibration procedures." The moral paradox admitted no resolution. Every strategic victory contained tactical tragedy. Every life saved required lives taken. Marsh had operated in war's central contradiction, the application of intelligence and violence toward constructive purpose. Some minds navigated this paradox through compartmentalization or ideology. Marsh possessed neither defense, only mathematical clarity that calculated costs in both directions simultaneously. Jones arranged for Marsh's transfer to research duties at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, removing him from operational stress while preserving his technical contributions. The young warrant officer spent the remainder of the war developing radar countermeasures, electronic warfare systems, and theoretical frameworks that would inform post-war communications technology. His work remained classified for decades, recognized only through code names and oblique references in official histories. In Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence services conducted systematic reviews trying to understand what had gone wrong on September 15th. They examined British radar capabilities, fighter deployment patterns, and coordination systems. Some analysts approached correct conclusions. British intelligence exceeded German assumptions, possibly through signals intelligence or human penetration of Luftwaffe planning staffs. None imagined that a single radar operator, working through exhausted nights with unauthorized equipment modifications, had accidentally discovered detection principles that wouldn't be formally theorized for another 3 years. The invasion fleet never reassembled. Those 847 aircraft were gradually dispersed to other theaters: Russia, Mediterranean, North Africa. The strategic moment passed, never to return. December 1940, Malvern, England. Winter settled over the Telecommunications Research Establishment like accumulated silence. Marsh worked in temperature-controlled laboratories far removed from operational pressure, surrounded by engineers and physicists who spoke his mathematical language. The nightmares gradually diminished, replaced by productive exhaustion. He published internal research papers on passive detection systems, wave propagation theory, and signal processing algorithms, work that would inform radar development through the Cold War and beyond. But certain truths remained unspoken even in technical documentation. The moment of discovery, that accidental loose connection, that inexplicable pattern on his oscilloscope, had emerged from desperation and intuition rather than systematic methodology. Marsh couldn't fully explain why he'd recognized significance in patterns other operators dismissed as noise. Some element of perception existed beyond formal training, a cognitive pattern matching that operated beneath conscious articulation. Jones understood this implicitly. Scientific breakthrough often emerged from observers who saw what everyone else had ignored, who questioned assumptions so fundamental that no one thought to question them. Newton and his apple, Fleming and his contaminated petri dish, Marsh and his misaligned transmitter. Progress frequently announced itself through accident, witnessed by prepared minds. "Your calibration trick," Jones told him during their final meeting before Jones returned to London, "represents something rather profound. You demonstrated that our theoretical understanding remains incomplete, that innovation still lives in spaces between established doctrine and individual insight." "I just saw a pattern, sir. Nothing profound about pattern recognition. On the contrary, recognizing patterns that shouldn't exist according to accepted theory requires precisely the kind of intellectual courage that changes paradigms. You didn't merely operate equipment. You questioned its theoretical limitations and discovered they were narrower than assumed." Across occupied Europe, German technical specialists had begun developing their own advanced radar systems, learning lessons from September's catastrophic losses. The technological arms race would continue throughout the war, each side developing countermeasures to the other's innovations, spiraling toward electromagnetic sophistication that would have seemed impossible in 1939. But the strategic initiative had shifted permanently. Britain survived 1940, preserved operational sovereignty, maintained capacity to serve as launching point for eventual Allied return to continental Europe. The pathway from Marsh's oscilloscope to Normandy beaches ran through accumulated small victories and prevented catastrophes, each individually insufficient, collectively decisive. In Suffolk, Bawdsey Station continued operations with standardized Marsh protocol calibration. New operators learned the technique without knowing its origins, applying modifications that had emerged from one sergeant's exhausted curiosity on a night when the world balanced on invisible radio waves and unauthorized mathematics. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Marsh stood among celebrating crowds in Malvern, watching people dance with liberation's pure joy. 5 years had passed since that September night when his oscilloscope had revealed patterns that changed history's trajectory. The war had ended exactly as systematic analysis predicted. German industrial capacity overwhelmed by Allied production, strategic position eroded through accumulated tactical defeats, ideology crushed beneath material reality's brutal mathematics. But Marsh understood something crowds couldn't see. History possessed no single pivot point, no decisive moment when victory became inevitable. Instead, war consisted of thousands of micro-decisions, small innovations, tactical adjustments, each individually insignificant, collectively transformative. His calibration trick had prevented invasion, but invasion's prevention had required simultaneous efforts across countless domains. Churchill's political resistance, Britain's industrial mobilization, fighter command's tactical adaptation, civilian resilience through bombing campaigns, intelligence services' systematic penetration of German planning. Jones found him at the celebration's edge, both men inhabiting characteristic distance from unqualified triumph. "You should be proud," the professor said quietly. "Your work mattered. My work killed people efficiently. That's different than mattering. No, your work prevented greater killing. It's not the same as moral neutrality, but it's not equivalent to murder either. War creates situations where all choices involve violence, and moral calculation requires comparing outcomes, rather than seeking absolute purity." Marsh had spent 5 years grappling with this philosophical framework. Mathematics possessed elegant certainty. Equations balanced perfectly. Theorems proved themselves through logical necessity. Morality offered no such clarity. His phase shift calibration had saved Britain but killed German airmen. It had prevented invasion but enabled continued war. It had protected civilization while contributing to civilization's systematic violence against itself. "I went to Cambridge to study pure mathematics," Marsh said. "I wanted understanding divorced from application, truth independent of consequence. Instead, I discovered that all knowledge becomes weaponized eventually, that curiosity and destruction share uncomfortable proximity." Jones nodded slowly. "That's the central tragedy of technical civilization. Every tool can be weapon. Every breakthrough carries dual potential. We can't unknow what we've learned, can't uncreate what we've invented. We can only choose imperfectly how knowledge applies toward constructive or destructive purpose." Around them, crowds sang and wept and embraced. Victory possessed complex texture, relief and grief, triumph and exhaustion, celebration shadowed by calculated costs. Marsh had helped create this moment through prohibited curiosity and mathematical insight. Whether that constituted heroism or something more ambiguous, remained permanently unresolved, suspended between necessity and doubt. Cambridge, 1963. Dr. William Marsh stood before a lecture hall full of undergraduate physics students, explaining principles of electromagnetic wave propagation. His academic career had resumed after the war, doctorate completed, research position secured, life reconstructed around teaching and theoretical investigation. The nightmares had faded mostly, replaced by professional routine and scholarly distance from operational pressure. His students knew nothing of Bawdsey, of cathode ray tubes glowing green in desperate darkness, of 847 aircraft revealed through unauthorized innovation. Official histories of the Battle of Britain mentioned radar's importance, but rarely detailed specific technical breakthroughs. Marsh's contribution remained classified until partial declassification in 1960, acknowledged through dry technical reports that communicated facts without capturing emotional texture. But sometimes, explaining wave theory to bright young faces, Marsh would pause mid-equation, remembering that September night when mathematics had manifested as life and death consequence. Theory and application possessed uncomfortable proximity. These students would graduate into worlds shaped by electronic technology, telecommunications revolution, strategic systems that traced lineage directly to wartime innovation. Knowledge, he told them during one lecture, is never neutral. Mathematics seems pure, divorced from moral calculation. But the moment we apply theoretical understanding toward practical purpose, we enter ethical territory. The equations I'm teaching you can enable communication or targeting systems, medical imaging or weapons guidance, constructive or destructive application. The mathematics doesn't change, but context transforms meaning. His students nodded with undergraduate certainty, not yet understanding how deeply war had taught him this lesson, how many nights he'd calculated costs in both directions simultaneously. After class, a promising student named Eleanor approached with questions about signal processing theory. Marsh explained concepts that had emerged partly from his wartime work, watching her eyes light with intellectual excitement. Knowledge perpetuated itself across generations, each cohort building on accumulated understanding. His phase shift calibration had contributed to broader theoretical framework, invisible ancestry to modern communications technology. Walking home through Cambridge streets where he'd once studied before war interrupted everything, Marsh reflected on questions that admitted no final resolution. Had his curiosity been morally justified? Had the lives saved outweighed lives taken? Did innovation require apology or merely clear-eyed acknowledgement of dual potential? The answers remained suspended between necessity and doubt. But this much he knew with mathematical certainty. Ignorance would have been worse. Knowledge created responsibility, but willful ignorance created only vulnerability. They arrived believing technology would decide the war cleanly, that superior engineering guaranteed victory. Instead, they discovered that human curiosity, unauthorized, improvised, desperately applied, could transform invisible radio waves into historical inflection points. We cannot unknow what we learn. We can only choose imperfectly how knowledge serves either construction or destruction. That choice defines civilization more than any equation ever could.